Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the Responsible Edge podcast with me, Charlie Martin. Join us as we learn from experts each week on how to build our startup, the Anti-Greenwash Charter, as successfully and ethically as possible. So today, I was delighted to be joined by Andrew Nind. Andrew's been someone that we've known for a while and we've been speaking to about all things greenwashing. And today we managed to convince him to come on and join us for a show of the Responsible Edge, which was absolutely fantastic. Andrew is an extremely seasoned sustainability consultant and expert within the energy sector, having worked on various projects over the last 30 years or so. He's held particularly significant roles, including director positions at places like Baringa Partners, Prioritise Management Consulting. I probably butchered that name. He's also holds an MA in mathematics from Cambridge University, so a very bright cookie. Today, Andrew and I had a really interesting conversation looking at the energy sector in the UK, talking about some of the issues at play, some of the things that the Labour government that's just come into power is looking to do with Great British Energy, etc., and kind of dissecting that, and crucially looking at kind of the future of energy in the UK and the impact of greenwashing as one of the key concerns, stagnating, if you like, the development and growth of the sector. So just wanted to say a big thank you to Andrew for joining us today. It was a really good conversation. I was slightly nervous about obviously having somebody as technically minded as Andrew joining us, but he did a brilliant job of explaining some fairly difficult concepts, if you like, technically, in a very easy to understand way. So really hope you enjoy the show. If you've got any questions or thoughts for us, please feel free to share via the sort of standard channels. And thanks again for listening. Andrew, just to kick off, and just wanted to say a big thank you for joining us today on the Responsible Edge podcast. We've known each other for a while now. It's been an not ongoing task. That's a wrong way of putting it, but it's been we've been trying to get you on for a while, and we've managed to snaff you this Friday morning. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Charlie. Pleasure.
Excellent stuff. So Andrew, as we kind of spoke about in our kind of preamble, we always like to start every show with really getting to know our guests as much as possible. Now, I know your background and experience, and think it's a really sort of a very interesting, very kind of there's a real depth, if you like, of experience that you've obviously gone through and things that you've done in your career. Feel free to start wherever you like in terms of introducing us to yourself. I mean, we have some guests that go back to kind of the inspirations of early years at school, all the way through to sort of starting with professional roles, etc. But just feel free to start wherever you like, and to perhaps touch upon, if you can, the role of kind of ethical and responsible kind of corporate practice has had on your career and the decisions that you've made.
Okay. Yep. Thanks, Charlie. Well, I'll start. I guess at kind of university, so won't go back to sort of childhood, toddlerhood or anything. But so I came out of university in the late '80s with a maths degree, not really knowing what I wanted to do. Fortunately, it was a time in the late '80s, unlike today. It was a time when if you were a graduate in the UK, you were fairly likely to get work somewhere. So even though I didn't particularly know what I was going to do, I managed to get work, and I kind of drifted into the energy sector. Mm-hmm. So I worked for a few years in operational research, and then I worked for, at the time, the country had a lot of kind of regional electricity companies. So I worked for one in the early 90s called East Midlands Electricity, really as a kind of a commercial analyst, helping them with their kind of basically their purchase decisions. So they're purchasing in bulk from the big generators, and I was kind of analyzing all of that power, if you like, and whether the deal was a good deal or a bad deal. And it was quite an interesting time because it was the time when Michael Heseltine announced the closure of 31 out of 50 remaining deep mines, deep coal pits in Britain, which was a big thing at the time. And we were involved in kind of effectively keeping the remaining husk of British coal as it was, kind of contracted for the next, I can't remember, the next 5 or 10 years or something, through kind of back-to-back contracts. And anyway, I then moved into energy consulting in sort of the mid-90s. And so for the last 25 years, I've been in energy consulting, really in kind of market advisory consulting. So kind of doing a lot of the kind of the commercial analysis on new power projects in Britain and in Europe, including sort of electricity interconnectors. So I did a lot of work on that, on interconnectors between Britain and Norway, France, Ireland, Belgium, etc.
Right.
And I mean, in terms of kind of what drove me, and sort of business ethics, I suppose that I wasn't a completely typical consultant ever, because I was never very good at being very kind of glossy. When I was younger, in particular, I'd be incredibly straight and actually rather pedantic.
How incredibly refreshing, Andrew. I was going to say, as a consultant, I think that's why you've been so successful. It's been, to be straight as a consultant.
I suppose so. I mean, I fairly rapidly developed a reputation for being someone who wouldn't tell the client what the client wanted to hear, but would at least say what they genuinely thought about things. I remember quite early on an instance I was later teased by my colleagues about, where we were analyzing a new power project and we were on the phone, and this power project, the analysis just wasn't really stacking up. It just didn't look as though it was going to be particularly viable. And on the phone, the client was getting quite frustrated with us because they thought we were being unimaginative. We hadn't considered the right scenarios. We hadn't looked at it in the right way. And I said very bluntly, well, just because the analysis doesn't look good doesn't mean that it's bad analysis. It could just be a bad project, which went down a bit like the proverbial lead balloon. And I was kind of teased remorselessly about that afterwards. I suppose over time I became a little bit less pedantic in my approach, but I suppose I was always relatively successful in managing to maintain, I guess, a degree of personal integrity in terms of saying what I thought. I was probably less successful in my career in terms of kind of steering the industry where I wanted it to go, if you like. I mean, as a consultant, you end up working for most people who come along and are willing to pay you, providing they don't have a criminal record and providing they're not obviously unethical. So we ended up having a kind of a wide variety of clients. In the 1990s, it was mainly about gas. There was a big kind of revolution in this country, a dash for gas. Gas had become very cheap, and we were essentially replacing coal-fired power stations with gas-fired power stations. And so I did a lot of work on the new CCGTs in the UK.
Sorry, Andrew. CCTGs.
Yeah, sorry, that's my first piece of jargon. I was seeing if you're still awake, Charlie. Actually, yeah. So CCGT stands for Combined Cycle Gas Turbine.
Okay.
So a lot of the power in Britain now is generated from CCGTs. So it's a kind of a two-stage process. There's kind of what's a bit like a sort of a jet engine gas turbine, which generates some power. And then you get some residual heat, which goes through a kind of conventional steam turbine, which generates more power. So you get two bites of the cherry, if you like, which increases the efficiency of the power station. Anyway, there was this big move to these CCGTs in the UK in the 1990s. And it was good in that it decarbonized the industry quite a lot. But actually, the industry wasn't really thinking about decarbonization. It was just thinking about money. And it made commercial sense to move away from coal and to gas at the time. And then since around about 2000, most of my work has been on renewables and developing wind and solar assets in Britain and other countries in Europe. And also electricity interconnectors, as I mentioned. And again, I'd like to think that I was kind of, driving or helping to drive this switch to renewables. But actually, again, it was to a large extent where the money was, really because there are quite generous subsidies for renewable generation, and also renewable costs were coming down. So it was a good time for renewables, has been a good time for renewables for the last 10 to 20 years. And so that's really kind of, been my career. In recent years, I've become very concerned about climate change. And the last kind of major paid work that I did was for an international bank, really helping to develop its net zero strategy and sort of implementation of its net zero approach internationally, at a kind of very detailed level. And I found that kind of a little bit frustrating, because it's so easy to try and redefine things in a way which makes it appear as though a company is approaching net zero, when actually what they're doing is they're just shifting the goalposts, or defining things in particular ways that give the impression that they're net zero when they're not really.
Well, it almost takes me back to your comment before, your story before, about mentioning to the client about the analysis perhaps not being wrong, but the project itself not being so good, i.e. that there's a requirement to shift the pieces around and make something appear to be something that it's not. There's an alignment with that.
Absolutely, that's right. And so in recent years, and this is where we kind of met, Charlie, I've become particularly interested in greenwashing in its kind of various shapes and forms, and how that could potentially be avoided. And so nowadays I kind of do less paid work and more sort of work off my own bat, voluntary work, or work, or what's the word? So advocacy for sort of anti-greenwash, amongst other things.
Andrew, it's fascinating. I want to dive into, or I want to ask you a few questions on career. So it sounds to me like you've had, in terms of, you've almost had a career that has been driven by, as much as anything, kind of commercial consideration up to this point, when you're now able to be in a sort of a position, if you like, to look at, well, actually, where are the opportunities to have a more sort of, a more significant sort of impact on shaping and developing how these things work, as opposed to following the commercial route set out in the energy sector. Is that a fair kind of synopsis of your experience?
Yeah, I think that broadly is fair. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I've always kind of said what I thought in terms of kind of the, if you like, the ethics of a project, but that hasn't necessarily, been the dominant influence, if you like. The dominant influence has been ultimately where is the money coming from, and does a project make commercial sense?
Do you think, is my other question regarding your career, do you think, in terms of the experience over the 25 years of working in the energy sector, how have things changed in terms of the way that it is, the speaking plainly, speaking truthfully, calling a spade, is that becoming more prevalent, do you think, within the energy sector, or less prevalent? Is it evolving, the way that generally people approach energy?
I'm not sure there's actually been that much change, to be honest. I mean, nowadays there's much more awareness of things like climate change, of the environmental impact, which wasn't there back in 1990. So that's a change in kind of people's awareness, and so it forms more of the discussion. But I'm not sure that's led to more plain speaking, particularly. I mean, it's kind of, it's a bit double-edged, because on the one hand, I think companies are making a lot more effort now than they used to make to think about their environmental impact, to try and reduce their environmental impact, and that's great. But it's not because necessarily they've become more truthful or more ethical. It's more because it's just higher on the agenda, and because everyone knows
the commercial consideration of it.
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
Coming full circle back to, in essence, the experience that you've had throughout your career, which is if it makes sense financially, it'll happen. If it doesn't, then ultimately it doesn't matter how plainly we speak, things are not going to change, which is what you described in terms of that frustration at the heart of some of the projects that you've worked on.
Yeah, well, I guess we can come back to that point. I suppose I'm still optimistic that things can change in terms of underlying culture, so the culture of business. But I think that's about kind of, increasingly developing the mindset whereby companies don't just see themselves as about making money for their particular project, but they have a sense of kind of, overall responsibility for the state that the world's in. As kind of companies and individuals. And to me, that's kind of developing that culture. I think, a lot of damage has been done in a way by the sort of the legacy of Adam Smith, or how Adam Smith is interpreted, the invisible hand. Everyone just kind of follows their own, niche thing and does what they're good at, and thinks that they're powerless to affect the what's happening in the world. And then magically, if everyone follows their self-interest, then you get an efficient economy. Curiously, Adam Smith himself had a strong sense of public service, which seems to be forgotten historically. But I think, it is possible, and maybe I'm kind of jumping the gun slightly, Charlie, but I think it is possible to develop that culture in business. And there are signs, there's companies I know which, focus on kind of the kindness in business, which sounds a little bit flaky, but actually that particular company I'm thinking of has done very well in kind of emphasizing, kindness in business, and things like, more pro bono work, a sort of a sense of devoting some of one's time and efforts to thinking about public service, even if one's in a private company. And so I'm optimistic that can be developed. It doesn't always have to be the case that money rules, I think, but it's a case of, developing the culture in the corporate world.
Andrew, that was super. Yeah, that was a brilliant summary and synopsis of what we need. I think we're done. I think we can pack that can be our headline.
Sorry about that. I got to the punchline a bit early.
No, I love it. I love it. We've got our show after 60 minutes. A couple more questions. You mentioned that you've become increasingly concerned about climate change in recent years. Can you pinpoint the moment, the event, was it just a growing concern over time, or can you just talk to us a little bit about? Lots of people obviously have that moment, I think, when things really strike them. Personally, I think on a very local level, the wildfires of a couple of years ago here in the UK was a real sort of moment for me of, oh my goodness, there's wildfires in the UK. That was a big moment for me personally.
Yeah.
Can you talk us through any of those moments for you that really stick in mind?
Yeah. So, well, I suppose going back, and this is stretching the meaning of the word recently and showing my age, but going back to 1997 and the Kyoto Protocol, I remember that. One thing I didn't say was I was actually born in Canada. So I am actually a Canadian citizen. And I mention it because Canada's performance in Kyoto is absolutely disgraceful, because they signed up, to a target of, I think it was a 6% reduction in greenhouse gases, and then made essentially no real significant effort to meet that target. And so they were on target, instead of a 6% reduction, for a 16% increase in greenhouse gas emissions. This is sort of comparing 1990 levels with 2000 levels, I think it was. And so they basically just decided to abandon their involvement in Kyoto. And that was quite striking when that happened, because it just showed almost the powerlessness of the international community and of these agreements to do anything. that you could have a country like Canada, signing up, making an international commitment, and then just deciding to abandon it. And there's no sanctions, no penalties, nothing happened. Everything just carried on as normal. So that was quite for me as a Canadian, that was quite a striking moment. And more recently, or I suppose much more recently, again, sticking with Canada, the incredible forest fires a few years ago was just extraordinary. I mean, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions from these forest fires in Canada a couple of years ago is equivalent to the greenhouse gas emissions from Belgium as a country. Just staggering emissions just from these forest fires. So that was quite a moment. I suppose there've been a kind of a number of moments along the way in between 1997 and the forest fires of a couple of years ago, which have kind of increased my my awareness and my concern. And most recently, there's what's happening in Greece and the Athens, the situation around Athens, and all these poor people are just having their lives destroyed. Schools that they're in burnt to the ground, the houses burnt to the ground, and kind of nowhere to go. And it really sort of brings home, it's easy for us in this country when we're not personally affected in quite the same way. You're living in the outskirts of Athens, and suddenly your whole life has just gone up in smoke, literally. Then that's it just makes it incredibly shocking, just the impact that climate change can have,
and very human. Very, very. There's no hiding place from the. But I think there's that element, isn't there, of the repeated kind of news stories. You worry about the kind of the apathy that might grow with seeing the same story again and again, and not seeing shift and change. And it's terrible, that is sort of part of our human nature, that if we see it enough, we'll just grow apathetic towards it. Do you share that kind of concern, that we hope that things obviously change at a rate that's significant enough that it kind of doesn't mean that it's just something that sort of falls by the wayside? Not that it can, obviously, because of the growing impact and implications of climate change, but just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's double-edged, because we are, we tend to adapt. We're very good at adapting, and part of that adapting is, as you say, kind of becoming almost blasé about terrible things that happen in the world if we're exposed to those terrible things, for days or months and in succession. But the flip side of that is, I think, because we are to some extent malleable, I think that there is potential for us to kind of emphasize our better nature, if you like. So going back to kind of the Adam Smith thing and just focusing on making money, I think we can operate in a way where we are more public spirited, and it's a matter of getting that into our kind of our corporate culture, as well as our individual responsibilities. I'm optimistic that given the right kind of leadership and the right change process, that we can operate in a way where actually we do take more responsibility for what's happening in the wider world, and that's reflected in corporate activity. And so I think our ability to adapt is kind of double-edged in that respect.
That was, I totally can agree and buy into that. Let me ask you, you mentioned that you're doing more of the kind of pro bono volunteering work, if you like, and specifically obviously looking to address, concerns or the issue around greenwash within the energy sector. Are you a living manifestation of the change of that culture, i.e. that you've got to a point of your career where you could be choosing ultimately to do more commercially focused consultancy, pieces of work that earn you lots and lots of money, but you're choosing to take on perhaps some of that, some of what you practice, if you like, and what you preach and ultimately practice yourself? Is that, am I giving too much of a sort of a grandiose props to you, or do you feel like you are living what you suggest?
Ideally, I'd wish I was more effective than I am. I mean, yes, to some extent, I'm now I'm a director of a Reading Community Energy Society, which basically puts solar panels on roofs. It's kind of a not-for-profit organization. I kind of, write articles. I sort of lobby my MP about greenwash and that sort of issue. I've put in, my own air source heat pump. So I to some extent, I try to, try to practice what I preach. How effective I am, I mean, it's all much smaller scale, I have to admit. Like, the local community energy society, it's tiny compared with what I'm used to by way of power projects. And there is a body of opinion that if one can encourage lots of, kind of community schemes, then you get a kind of a groundswell, which then can kind of, grow exponentially.
Mm-hmm.
We certainly need a lot of exponential growth. We're not there yet. So I feel as though, to some extent, I practice what I preach, but I'm not nearly as effective as I would like to be.
And let me ask you, Andrew, thank you for that response. And let me ask you about greenwash in particular. And I've done the classic thing, by the way, of just getting far too interested in asking you questions about you and your background. And we will have to come on to talking about our article in a second. But just to finish on greenwash. So what was it, you've kind of alluded to it before in terms of people ultimately, moving pieces around and perhaps shifting goalposts in order to facilitate the narrative that they want to produce. But can you just touch upon a little bit more about, what was it about, greenwashing is a very contentious, emotive issue. Like, can you just talk about your experience of it and why you identified it as something that you wanted to help address and how you're going about addressing that? You mentioned lobbying your local MP. Just give us a flavor of greenwash for you.
Yeah, sure. Well, maybe I'll sort of give an anecdote. So I have a friend who, for various reasons, uses a lot of electricity. And this friend, a few years ago, signed up to kind of one of these green tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
And the supplier wrote to her and said, you are a climate champion, because what the supplier had done was to take her electricity production and multiply it by the difference in the carbon content of average electricity, if you like, and zero, because she's now on this green tariff. So, and come up with a very large number of tons of carbon dioxide being saved. So I said, well, by that logic, what you should be doing is you should be turning on your oven full blast, leaving it on all the time, running your washing machine, even if there's no clothes to wash, all the time. Turn on all of the lights, because then you'll be saving the planet by this logic. So that kind of, really helped crystallize for me that the state which we got with kind of greenwash, the way it's kind of presented at the individual level, the way that companies are able to sell these kind of green tariffs to individuals. And so that's kind of at an individual level. And then I think at a corporate level, what's happened in this country is that the regulation has been concerned, well, it has been thinking pragmatically, thinking as long as we're getting renewable energy, say, being developed, it doesn't matter if suppliers or big corporates are saying that they're very green. Let's not worry too much about it. We're just focused on pragmatically on the results of getting more renewable energy being developed. And it's allowed, therefore, suppliers and corporates to make these claims. And the thing is that when a renewable project is developed, there are lots of components that support it. So a big component is something known as a contract for difference for the big projects in Britain, which is basically a way of stabilizing the revenues over a period of time, 15, 20 years, so that the wind farm, say, is confident of getting a steady income stream as long as it's generating.
Okay.
Now, that's got nothing to do with the supplier. So that's an instance of government support, public support, which helps to get a renewable project off the ground.
Mhm.
So when a supply company signs up with that wind farm and says, all my power is green, what we're allowing it to do is to take, in effect, all of the credit, when at the most it should only get part of the credit
Mhm.
for that project, because there are many other factors which have supported that project, like the contract for difference that I mentioned.
I'm with you.
And I think, the industry has been too blasé almost about allowing this to happen.
Mm.
And so I'm, to the extent that I kind of write articles and blog and try and influence the debate, I'm trying to say, well, look, what we need is a more honest way of measuring the genuine contribution that
Mhm.
companies or supply companies are making whenever they build or sort of not build, sign up to green power. And it goes, it's true for the individual and it's true at the corporate level as well.
And Andrew, let me ask you again. It's classic. We will have to get to the article, but why in coming back to your initial point, which is ultimately if investment in green and renewable energy is happening, why not allow people to ultimately over embellish their involvement, if that over embellishment is providing them with the means to invest in renewable and green technologies and innovations? Why is it that, from your perspective, it needs to be eradicated within the energy sector?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that there's a couple of reasons why. So the first, if maybe a way of kind of expressing this is to think of a particular example, like building a data center. So we've got lots of data centers being built, as we know, in countries like the UK now. When a data center is built, if it's sold on the basis that this data center is just consuming green power, so its carbon emissions are zero, then there's no incentive at all for that data center to reduce the amount of electricity that it's consuming. So this is one big problem, is that the people who are getting away, if you like, with these green claims have no incentive to try to reduce their energy consumption, which is one of the big ways that we can actually usefully be trying to, to reduce the carbon impact. So I think that's a big problem. And I think the other big problem is that when companies have targets, if it's relatively easy for them to meet those targets, and actually we could talk about Great British Energy, because I've concern here about Great British Energy. If it's relatively easy for those companies to meet those targets, then they don't need to try so hard. They don't need to be developing their own projects. So I think you get these two effects. One, on the supply side, that companies don't need to try as hard if it's easy for them through greenwash.
Mm-hmm.
And on the demand side, there's no incentive to reduce electricity demand. But I think the basis of your question is entirely right, that, well, I think it's entirely reasonable to think, well, does it actually matter? And I think it does matter for these two reasons.
Well, and if I'm understanding you correctly, it's the fact that it's one thing that the investment and growth of renewables is occurring, but greenwashing is almost stagnating the potential development and growth of green and renewable energy because of those two issues that you've described.
That's right. It's stagnating the growth of green energy, and also it's not addressing the demand side,
Mm-hmm.
which is very important, and generally, because it's politically difficult, is generally kind of left alone.
Which comes back to the example that you shared of your friend who is on the green tariff and could therefore be encouraged to utilize as many energy-using appliances.
Yeah. Leave the oven on 24/7. Yeah.
Leave the oven on 24/7. We're not condoning that, by the way, on the show. That's just to be absolutely clear. Andrew, again, brilliantly, we've talked about and I thought this was going to happen with you. We were going to go on into all sorts of different areas. But you did mention Great British Energy. So I think what would be great now, could we just introduce the article that we obviously shared with you before the show? I think there's obviously a nuance in terms of when it was published and obviously what's happened since. So would you mind briefly introducing it and picking out whatever the most kind of salient points are to you for our listeners to understand?
Yeah, that's right. So this is the article in the New Statesman about the energy sector reform that the UK needs, and kind of so it was a roundtable discussion at the Conservative Party conference, and it was talk about the need to be developing more green energy, more wind and more solar. It's focused on kind of appealing to people's self-interest in a way, in terms of not being reliant on foreign power, not being reliant on Putin, say, by developing our own resources, our own wind and solar, and focusing political public attention on the issues, that the need for self-sufficiency as a kind of a means for encouraging the development of green energy in the UK. I think, and this kind of feeds in naturally to the development of Great British Energy, which is the Labour government's plan. The concern that I have is that the industry is already making good progress, or pretty good progress, in terms of becoming greener. Mm-hmm. So in 2023, 46% of the electricity generated in this country was from renewables. So nearly half of the electricity is from renewables. Now, it may be that Great British Energy, adds to that and increases the impetus, if you like, but it's already going in that direction, and it's not completely obvious that government stepping in is going to make the transition happen faster than it's already happening. Mm-hmm. And a concern that I have is that actually we probably won't talk about them so much, but the sectors that really need decarbonizing even more are heat and transport, because mm-hmm. the emissions from heating buildings and the emissions from the transport sector are greater than the emissions from the power sector. But they're also politically more difficult sectors to tackle. I mean, the thing about electricity is that it's quite sort of unpopular. I mean, people don't like paying much money for their electricity, so it's a relatively easy industry to bash, if you like. It's a relatively easy political target. So I think that the development of Great British Energy has, to some extent, the sense of being easier politics than tackling, say, heat or transport. So I think the jury is a bit out about Great British Energy, and it makes the role of the state, or it brings the role of the state into focus. Mm-hmm. What would the state be doing? I think the state should certainly be providing vision, providing planning reform, support for new fledgling industries or new fledgling technologies. That's all great, and that's very much definitely what the state should be doing. Whether the state should be intervening when something's already up and running, as it were, or seems to be making pretty good progress, as the power sector does in terms of decarbonization, I think is more open to debate. So I'm not completely certain that it's necessarily the best idea.
Andrew, that was so well introduced. You've given me so much more clarity and context around Great British Energy and its development. A couple of questions. Would it be fair to say that you think that the Labour government have picked energy as the low-hanging political fruit and the thing that can bolster sort of public opinion, if you like, upon the proactive steps that they're taking at this stage? Why is that a fair synopsis?
I think The truth is that I don't know. So I have to caveat with this fact that I might well be wrong. But my sense, my instinct is that yes, that is the case. Yeah.
And then just for my own clarity, when you talk about the heating sector, you talk about the transport sector, and you talk about how they are more challenging, if you like, to overcome politically. Can you just briefly explain why?
Yeah. So I think, well, if you take transport, so electric vehicles are still relatively expensive. People don't like the thought of paying more for transport than they have to. So I guess most people will think, well, they'd rather have, say, a petrol car because it's cheaper. And there's also quite a lot of concern still about, electric vehicles having fires, for instance, or you not being able to drive up to Scotland in your electric vehicle. So there's a lot of sort of suspicion still about electric vehicles, which makes, I think, support for electric vehicles more difficult. And then sort of similarly in the heating sector, there's quite a lot of suspicion about whether an air source heat pump, for instance, and we've got one, it seems to be working fine, but whether it's going to be able to meet the demand on a very cold day in January, whether it's going to be reliable, whether actually it might end up costing more because the installation costs are still relatively high. So I think these are more difficult sectors because they tap into personal feelings of security or insecurity around transport and around heating, which makes people naturally cautious. And so, it's therefore more difficult to kind of make progress in decarbonizing those sectors.
That, and Andrew, that was so brilliantly explained and described. And in all honesty, it fills me with a slight, in terms of the choices that the government therefore have made in light of Great British Energy. Let me ask you, you touched upon it, patriotism and the impact and role that can play for the UK in terms of our energy transition. Do you buy that? What's your comment on the role that can play in us in the dial shifting even further? Because can I just, in fact, let me just clarify as well. When you said 46% of all electricity produced in the UK has come from renewables, that's not 46% of our overall energy usage.
No, that's true.
That's
true. It's a smaller percentage. I think it's under 40% of our electricity usage because we import quite a lot. So that's just in terms of what was generated in 2023. I think the patriotism line, which was mentioned in that article, New Statesman, I think it's got some force to it because I think that there is a lot of concern about reliance on other countries. I mean, ironically, from my perspective, I worked a lot on electricity interconnection, to, as I say, to France and Norway and Belgium and Ireland, etc. And of course, there you are reliant on other countries to flow the electricity through to GB. So I'm not sure that I personally am a great fan of this sort of nationalism when it comes to energy. But if it does mean that there's more public support for building offshore wind in the North Sea, for instance, then I think it can serve a purpose. I think it's a difficult thing to quantify, but there is an element there where, it does have some force to it.
And I am jumping around here, but it's because I haven't got much more of your time. So I'm jumping in with different sporadic questions, I know. But I really wanted to get your take. A conversation came up this week, actually, with a partner that we're working with at the Charter. And we were talking about AI, and we were talking about the potential impact of, and we're already starting to see it, of the big tech companies starting to invest more in green and renewable energy technology, with an understanding of the requirements that AI is going to have from an energy perspective and the necessity for expanding the capacity of that. I'd love to get I knew I was speaking to you today, so I was like, I've got an expert in the room. What's your take on that? Is that something that you think will drive innovation and growth and development in the renewables sector, or is that a pipe dream?
I think the jury is out, really. I mean, this comes back to greenwash and greenwash concerns. I think some of the big tech companies are, amongst the best in the world at presenting themselves as being very green and coming up with all sorts of arguments. There's an interesting article in the FT yesterday, I think, about Amazon and Meta wanting to kind of make the rules around emissions credits more flexible geographically, so that they could develop projects in parts of the world, I don't know, India or China, where there's much greater emissions, and use those emissions credits basically to offset, to reduce their own measurement of greenhouse gas emissions. And their argument, and it's an interesting argument, is that if you make it geographically completely flexible, then you can, if you like, invest in parts of the world where you've got the biggest bang for your buck in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's quite a sort of a plausible, sensible sounding argument. The difficulty is thinking, well, what about the counterfactual? And one always needs to think, well, what would happen anyway? Or in an alternative world where you didn't have these companies doing what they're doing, would you get the renewable projects being developed anyway? And is it the case that what they're just doing is attributing those green projects to their own account and taking credit for what's going to happen anyway? And I think this is always the key question to ask is, what is the net effect in terms of humanity's greenhouse gas emissions here? And when tech companies take actions, they aren't necessarily increasing humanity's progress. They might be, but it's something that needs to be examined carefully.
Andrew, that was brilliant. I mean, I get a sense of, I just depicted this again, but it's been a common theme throughout the conversation, the moving of the pieces around in order to create a different vision for, that aligns with the narrative that an organization or a government is ultimately trying to portray, which comes back to your key concern of how we address greenwashing within the energy sector. But you've done brilliantly to respond to my completely sporadic jumping around a little bit there. We've hit near enough the end of the show. I would love to get your take. As I say, we always finish with if we were to hand that magic wand over to you, Andrew, and say, what's that one thing that if you could change right now about the corporate world, what would it be? I'd be fascinated to know, perhaps with your energy hat on, what you'd like to change overnight.
Yeah. So I think overnight, if I could, it's really a change in culture. If every company had a corporate culture of doing something for the public good, I think that would be, my dream. And it comes back to the sort of the Adam Smith line that I mentioned, the sort of the culture that we've developed in the Anglo-Saxon world of kind of sticking to what we do, making money and not worrying, and also the view that we have no influence, whether we're individuals or companies, that we have no influence over things like greenhouse gas emissions or the state of the planet generally. I mean, if we can change that so that everyone thinks, well, actually, we are responsible collectively for the state of the planet, so we will take some action to some public action, whether it's through more pro bono work. I mean, I was thinking, I think it's in Islam, there's this idea of spending, I think, 10% of one's wealth on charitable investments. I mean, you could roll that out pro bono work, for instance, and just developing that culture where companies and individuals don't think that they're powerless, but think that actually we do all share responsibility, and therefore, in addition to doing whatever they do, devote some of their time and some of their resources to doing something addressing you know, whether it's climate change, whether it's gender inequality, whether it's, you know, the state of people living in the developing countries, whatever it is. I think that would be a fantastic achievement. And I think that it is genuinely possible because of what we talked about earlier, that people are, I think, you know, malleable, and to some extent people behave the way they're perceived to behave and the way, you know, their own self-perceptions. And we can change those perceptions, then we can change behavior, I think.
Andrew, I love that. I was going to ask you, I know that's the overnight change, so let's sort of draw it back to where it is. Do you think this is starting to happen though, with the likes of B Corp and, you know, other sort of initiatives? Do you think that this is starting to occur? Is it not?
I think it is starting to occur, and, you know, I mean, it's easy to be cynical about things like greenwashing. I think greenwash is a problem, but I think even leaving that, or accepting that reality that it is a problem, I think it is starting to happen. That's right. I mean, a company I used to work for now stresses kindness. I think I might have mentioned this. Apologies. Yeah. You know, and it sounds a bit corny, but actually they've had some success with this. There's the B Corp initiative that you've said. You know, I know a lot of companies that, you know, spend quite a lot on, well, allow employees to spend quite a lot of their time on pro bono work. I think, you know, it is happening. So I'm reasonably optimistic that we can get an improvement in corporate culture.
We just need it to happen more imminently, more consistently. We need joined up thinking, that collective consciousness, if you like, what we need to do.
Yeah, I don't know how we make it happen. I mean, you know, you could say, well, ESG reporting should be mandatory for all companies. I don't know. I don't know what the right mechanism is, but I feel one way or another, the goal is to develop that culture at the corporate level. How one gets to that goal, I don't know the answer.
Well, we'll leave it on that, Andrew, and we'll sort of titillate that there might be a future show where we might just answer that question, listeners. If we can get Andrew back on, we can dive into that as our starting point. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us this morning. That was a very interesting conversation. As I said, I got far too excited really on you and your background and experience, but I think for our listeners, it's really interesting to hear about, you know, the things that you've been involved in and the things that you've highlighted as being concerning moving forward. And I think you would have inspired some minds by the conversation we've had today. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlie. It's very enjoyable. Thank you.